financial stress on the parents translates into physiological stress in the children. They didn't inherit anything in terms of a disease. They're just reacting to the environment.
People call Dr. Gabor Mate the people whisperer.
Legendary thinker and best-selling author.
He's highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, stress, and childhood development.
The evidence linking mental illness and childhood adversity is about as strong as the evidence linking smoking and lung cancer. And the average physician doesn't hear a word about that. It's astonishing. I can give you the example of Donald Trump. I mean, his father was a psychopath.
You are the enemy of the people. Go ahead.
For him, these were not choices so much as survival techniques, and that's the mark of a traumatized child, a denial of reality.
What do I have to understand about your earliest years to understand you?
My grandparents were killed in Auschwitz, and my mother and I barely survived. And then my mother, to save my life, gives me to a stranger. The sense I get is that I'm being rejected and abandoned because I'm not good enough.
How did that rear its ugly head throughout your life?
Any number of ways. See, trauma, as I define it, is not about what happens to us. It's about what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. It's costing us in terms of our physical health, our relationship, our mental health, and so on.
How does one go about correcting that?
It's a multi-layered answer. First of all,
before this episode begins, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our new subscribers. 74% of you that watch this channel didn't subscribe before, and we're now down to about 71%. So that helps us in a number of ways that are quite hard to explain, but simply the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests get. So if you haven't yet subscribed to the Diary of a CEO, if I could have any favors from you, if you've ever watched this show and enjoyed it, it's just to please hit the subscribe button. Without further ado, I'm Stephen Bartlett, and this is the Diary of a CEO. I hope nobody's listening, but if you are, then please keep this. Long months do I take it in hand, the pen, so that I may briefly sketch for you the unspeakable horrors of those times, the details of which I do not wish you to know. Those are words that your mother wrote into her diary in the 1940s during the Holocaust.
she wrote those words in April of 1945, 3 months after the Soviet army expelled the Nazis from Budapest, which is where we lived. So she was referring to the previous year and the beginning of that year, late 1944 and early 1945.
And in those diary entries, she's addressing many of them to you directly as a baby.
She wrote the diary to me directly, as if it was like an account of my life addressed to me.
You talk so much in all your books and much of your work about the importance of that early context. It's really been, the center point of all the writing that I've read recently. And I know, because it's so evident in everything that you've done, that's been a key, your own early context has been a key inspiration for why you've taken such an interest in these topics. What was your early context? What do I have to understand about your earliest years to understand you?
So it's just a fact about human beings that the template that forms us will affect how we see the world, how we understand ourselves, how we relate to other people. And that early template is our earliest months, even in utero, already in the womb, we're being affected by the environment, but certainly in the early years when our brain is being formed and our personality is taking shape. And so that forms our worldview. Now, my worldview was, in my sense of self, was shaped by the fact that at 2 months of age, when I was 2 months of age, the German army occupied Hungary. Hungary was the last country in Eastern Europe where the Jewish population had not been exterminated, and that was our turn. The day after the German army marched into Budapest, which was March the 19th, 1944, the day after, my mother called the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time. And the doctor said, of course I'll come, but all my Jewish babies are crying. And so that the fact is that when mothers are stressed or in pain, the infant feels all that and takes it personally, and it becomes part of their template for how they view the world. So that was that year. That's when that year began, in which my grandparents were killed in Auschwitz, and my father was away in forced labor, and my mother and I barely survived. And it's a story I've told many times, but that's when my brain is developing, and that's when I'm forming my sense of myself. And then my mother to save my life gives me to a stranger and I don't see her for 6 weeks, the sense I get is that I'm not wanted and I'm being rejected and abandoned and because I'm not good enough. That's how my life began.
So your mother gives you away for 5 to 6 weeks in order to sort of save you from starvation in a ghetto that she was going to, right?
That's right.
This is after your grandparents were killed in Auschwitz by the Nazis. How do you know in hindsight that moment of those 6 weeks created that sense of abandonment in you?
I wouldn't say it's just that one moment. Children very much view themselves through their interaction with their parents. Now, first of all, I had no father because he was gone. I hadn't seen him, except very briefly when I was a month old. But there was no father in the picture. My mother was grief-stricken and terrorized and full of woe and worry about what's going to happen to us and just the task of surviving each day. She's not playful with me. She's not smiling at me very much. She's worried looking. She's stressed looking. The infant takes everything personally. That's just the nature of the infant. As infants, we're narcissists. We think it's all about us. So when things are great, hey, we're great. But when my mother's unhappy, it's because she doesn't want me or I can't make her happy or I'm inadequate. So that separation from my mother certainly set a template for some of my relationship interactions with my spouse decades later. But the sense of not being good enough and being responsible, that was inculcated in me throughout that whole first year of life. So much so that in this book, The Myth of Normal, I actually talk about an experience with the psychedelic mushrooms with a therapist. This is not that long ago, 7 years ago maybe, when I'm at least 70 years old. And I'm in this therapeutic session with the psilocybin, the medicine, and the therapist. And I know that I'm 70 years old, and I know this is a therapy session, and I know her name, and I know who I am in the world. But at the same time, I'm experiencing myself as a 1-year-old baby, and she's my mother. And I start crying. Tears come down my face, and I say, I'm so sorry I made your life so difficult. Now, that was an unconscious memory of my sense of myself as a 1-year-old, that I made my mother's life so difficult, because that's the way the baby interprets it. So even if your mother loves you, which mine did infinitely, not that she always treated me the best way possible, but she did love me. And can you imagine what a great act of love even giving me to a stranger in the street would have been for her, you know? But because of her own unhappiness, I can only conclude that I'm not good enough. And it's my fault.
At 70 years old, having that psilocybin experience, coming to that realization, or having that sort of, having that response to your therapist where they take the role of your mother and you're a 1-year-old. How does somebody at 70 years old go about correcting that sort of interpretation you had of that traumatic early event?
Well, by bringing up to the conscious level. Then when I notice that sense of guilt or responsibility in me, I say, oh, that's what it's about. So it's a meaning. See, trauma, as I define it, is not about what happens to us. It's about what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. And so the wound in trauma means wound. So the wound in this case is my sense of deficiency or not being good enough, not being worthy enough. Once I realize that, oh, this has got nothing to do with anything except this interpretation that I made of my own experience all those years ago, then when I notice it, I can no longer believe it. I don't have to any longer be a subject to that interpretation of myself in the world. So awareness is one step. It's not adequate, but it's an essential step towards letting go.
That one belief that you weren't good enough, how did that rear its ugly head throughout your life?
It made me a workaholic physician because I had to keep proving my worth. And it doesn't matter. Now, I don't know if you ever had an addiction, but the nature of it is that we're trying to get from the outside something that only can arise and fulfill us from the inside. So when you're looking at it from the outside, it's addictive because you get it temporarily, but then that internal emptiness, that hole, never goes away. So it has to be filled over and over and over again. It can only be done so temporarily. So it becomes runaway addictive. So then, work becomes an addiction because I keep trying to prove my worth. And it doesn't matter how many times, I may show up in a positive way at the beginning of someone's life, at the end of somebody else's life, or any time in between. It never fills that emptiness that my sense of lack of worthiness creates. So that's one way it shows up. Another way it shows up is if in my relationship, I don't feel as satisfied. My wife doesn't please me the way I like her to. Then I get angry. But why am I getting angry? I'm getting angry because it's my sense of not being good enough that's being now revealed. It gets uncovered, this self-accusation. But I get angry at her because her job is to make me not feel that. We get into this relationship for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are conscious, some are not. Some are positive, some are come out of trauma. And in my case, I want that relationship to prove to me how good I am. So when it isn't proving that, then I get upset at my partner, Well, except the gap is inside me, not inside. It's not coming from her. So it showed up in my parenting. It shows up all over the place.
I mean, I think both of those examples sound a lot like me, especially the first one.
Yeah.
The second one as well. But
in what sense?
In the sense that I'm definitely a workaholic. And I think in the earlier phases of my life, I sacrificed everything in this pursuit of becoming a millionaire and having all this stuff and really getting this validation. Sacrificed meaningful connections, everything in the pursuit of this one thing.
Well, part of the toxicity of the culture that I talk about in this book is that it actually rewards that kind of emptiness or that desperate seeking to fill that emptiness, because you get rewarded. You make a lot of money. A lot of people admire you. You get to feel good about yourself. Mind you, my guess is that good feeling is only temporary. At least if my example is any guide, that feeling good because somebody from the outside values you is only a temporary salve for the wound that's inside. But the world actually rewards it. So you're a workaholic doctor, great, you make more money, and all these people respect you. Meanwhile, you're hollowing yourself from the inside, and you're not available for your family. So that's part of the craziness of this culture.
And it's like the hedonistic treadmill in a sense, because you just enough is never enough, as you say.
Yeah.
So the last achievement needs to be surpassed by a greater achievement for me to get an applaud or a clap. I've never really made the connection that the reason why I'm a workaholic is because I am trying to prove to the world that I'm enough. But I think that is entirely true.
Yeah. So in your case, like race and class in this society of inequality are certainly potentially traumatic inputs, as I pointed in this book, and to the degree that it affects people's physiology, But also then, I don't know your family origin or what kind of relationship you have with your parents, but there also may have been a sense, like I got with my mom for reasons, and for whatever might have happened in your family, maybe you got the sense as well that even in your family of origin you weren't good enough somehow.
So my mum would scream at my dad for 7 hours a day, and my dad would just sit there.
Okay.
And so my early memories of looking at my mum and dad are this kind of violent verbally, not physically, this incredibly stressful screaming, one person screaming at the other. Yeah. That's what I remember. But from reading what you've written in this book and from what you've said now, I actually might have learned that I was the problem to some degree.
Children interpret it that way. That's just the whole point. That's what I mean about kids being narcissists. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, actually, they think it's all about them. So if your mother is unhappy, it's your fault, and you're not good enough. So then you have to go out there and work to prove to the world and to yourself that you're good enough. So that, going back to your first question about how these things show up in our lives, that's how they show up.
And so 12 years old, you emigrate to Vancouver.
Yeah.
by 28, you joined the medical profession.
Yeah.
And you spend the next 32 years, roughly, working in medical practice?
At 28, I went back to medical school, actually. I took a detour. I was a high school teacher for a while. And then I was 27, 28 when I started medical school. At age 33, I think I began my medical career of 32 years.
And in those 33 years, what was your practice? What did you specialize in? What did you focus on?
So I was a family physician, which meant I delivered a lot of babies and I looked after people's problems from beginning to the end of life. I also worked in palliative care. I was the director of a unit at the hospital, which looked after people with terminal disease. And that was 22 years or so of my practice, 22 years. And then I switched gears altogether and I went to work in the downtown east side of Vancouver, British Columbia, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. We have more people coming from anywhere in the world are shocked by what they see there. Thousands of people in the streets injecting, selling, using, inhaling, ingesting drugs of all kinds, and people are suffer the consequences of drug use in a society that doesn't understand drug use, so it punishes it and excludes it, ostracizes it. So people get HIV from dirty needles and hepatitis C. So this is the population. Often they're homeless. So that's the population I worked with for 12 years till the end of my medical work.
That experience working with patients that were in palliative care.
Yeah.
So that's, for anybody that doesn't know, that's patients that are approaching the end of their life, that have terminal illnesses and that are aware that they're going to die. What did that experience teach you?
It took an acceptance of one's lack of omnipotence as a physician. Because you go into you want to cure people, you want people to heal. And now it takes a tremendous acceptance to say, we've reached the limit of our knowledge. And that doesn't mean we can't help people, but we certainly can't cure them. And so it taught me how to be with the inevitable. And when you're working with people who are in the process of dying, by the way, who isn't in the process of dying, but people whose time is more limited than the rest of us. Acceptance, you learn a lot of acceptance. It challenges you to do your best when you know your best isn't going to be saving anybody's lives, but it's to help people live a life of as little suffering as possible and as much dignity as possible. So it really challenges the best parts of you to show up. Patience, acceptance, intuition. Personally, it taught me a lot to listen to people. Interesting enough, people really want to be heard when they're dying. They want to make sense of their lives. They want to tell their stories, then I want their stories to be heard. And so I listened a lot. I just sat by the bedside and I listened. All that.
When you listened, did you hear any themes relating to regret or things that actually mattered? Because I always imagine if I was given such news that my life was coming to an end and there was an approximate date, it would be quite a powerful way of finally realizing what truly matters and what never did.
People react to their impending death in different ways. So there were some people who just fought it to the end, they didn't really want to accept it. But most people were more along the lines that you described, where they really get to see what's important. And so I mentioned this a number of times. It sounds strange, and I don't recommend it. But I've had patients say to me, "Doctor, I don't know how to tell you this, and I can't even explain it perhaps, but this illness that's going to take my life is the best thing that ever happened to me." And what they meant a couple of things by it. They meant what you just said about finding out what's really important in life. In this book, The Myth of Normal, I interview a young man called Will Pye, who wrote a book called Blessed with a Brain Tumor. What kind of blessing is that? So I asked Will, what's the blessing? And he said, it made me appreciate every moment. It meant every time I talked to somebody, I knew this might be the last conversation I'm going to have with them. So it better be a human, genuine interaction. So there was that aspect of it. The other aspect of it was that again, my view is, as I pointed in this book and in previous works, who gets sick and who doesn't isn't exactly accidental. There are certainly personality patterns based on traumatic experiences in childhood that make disease more likely. And people very often realize that throughout their lives, they had abandoned who they were. They lived a life that wasn't meaningful for them. And on death, they reconnected with themselves in an authentic way. And that seemed to be worth a lot to people. Again, I don't recommend that way of going, to reconnect with yourself, but people have I certainly saw it. So those are the two big lessons.
After your 33 years in medical practice, you described that you had you kind of tuned into a creative calling, which was writing.
Well, I began to write when I was a physician. So
Okay.
My first book on ADHD, after I was diagnosed with it, was published in 1999 now. So that was 23 years ago now. So I began to write. And even before then, I wrote, because I wrote columns for newspapers. But yes, there was a time in my life where the writing impulse, which had been with me all my life, was stifled and stymied. And so was I, because I had this frustration. In fact, I had this sense that there's something I needed to express, but I didn't know what and I didn't know how. And at some point I realized, oh yeah, I need to write. So that began before I finished medical practice, but it certainly has been essential to my ongoing unfolding as a human being.
I was so compelled by that when I read about that, because I've started to really understand the value of creativity in all of our lives, regardless of whether we have the luxury of being called an artist or not. And so what, in your view, is the importance of
Well, you're singing my tune here, if I may say it that way, because I quote in this book, there's a great Hungarian-Canadian stress researcher called János Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, and Selye is the one who actually coined the word stress in the sense that we use it today. And he's the one that showed in the laboratory how stress diminishes the immune system and disorganizes the hormones and ulcerates the stomach and all this kind of stuff. But Selye also said, and I quote him here, what is in us must out. What is in us must out. That we all have to follow our creative urges in the way that nature prepared for us. Otherwise, we can be hopelessly hemmed in by frustration. I'm paraphrasing him very closely. So we are created in the image of God. I mean, as you know, whatever your religious views are, but that sense that we're created in the images of God means that we are creators, because the essence of God is creation. In fact, we call God the creator, and we call the result of that creation. If we're created, and if we're offshoots of that creative dynamic in the universe, then it means that it's in us to create. And whatever form that takes, I mean, you know, you don't want to see me do art, you know, unless you... I can do a pretty good stick figure, you know, but I'm married to an artist. So that creativity doesn't have to take the form of formal art, but it does have to take some flow of something that's inside you that needs to come out. Otherwise, as Selye says, you get hopelessly hemmed in by frustration. And so in that sense, everybody's got that creative urge, and that may take the form of social intercourse. It might take the form of gardening, I don't care, communing with nature, athletic expression, I don't care what. But there's somebody, everybody's got it. And if people don't realize they have it, it's only because life has hemmed them in and they're too busy. And sometimes they are trying to make a living or trying to survive or too disconnected from themselves. But it's in all of us. And to the extent that we don't give it expression, we suffer.
One of the things that really hems it in is the prospect that we might not be good at it, because we think to express ourselves creatively, we kind of join a competition of sorts. And that's a trap we can fall into. So if I'm going to DJ, I need to become a good DJ, but in social comparison, or else I don't want to. But what I've come to learn is, in fact, the act of DJing alone in my kitchen at midnight is the reward, regardless of outcome or whether there's a crowd there. If it's just me and my dog listening, That is the expression, is the reward, not the achievement or the medal that I might get. Or the
not the external. Well, look, I went through that in the writing of this book. So here I am, this, writer who writes about, trauma and, healing, and all of a sudden I'm in a panic because I'm writing a book. And I realized that the problem was that you talked about identifying with your work. So I'd identify with this book. So the problem wasn't the book. Because let's say I write the book and it's not a success. I mean, okay, big headline in the Sunday Times. Book, not a big success. Like, how big a big deal is that in the history of the universe? But if I identify with the book and it's not going well, then if the book fails, then I'm failing as a person, which then goes back to my very earliest concern about not being worth it, So once I disidentified, once I said, no, this is just a book. It may be a good book, it may be an important book, maybe a book that doesn't hit the mark, but it's only a book. And how it goes says nothing about me or my worth. Once I could decouple that, then I could confidently and much more comfortably go back to the writing of it. But I went through that crisis.
It seems like a bit of a paradox that the lack of self-worth would motivate someone to create great things because they want the approval, but at the same time make the process so agonizing because their self-esteem seems to be on the line.
Yeah.
Or their sense of self-worth is on the line.
Well, that dynamic was in me. Once I realized it, I let go of it. So it didn't dominate me in the end. And honest to God, by the time I finished the book, I'm not just saying this in retrospect. It's a bestseller now in several countries, but I actually said to myself, and I meant it, now I've done the book, that's what matters. I've said what was in me to say. How the world reacts, I can't control. And it doesn't actually matter. On a fundamental level, it's not that I don't want this book to be a success. I mean, success, of course I want it to sell 10 zillion copies, but that doesn't define my self-worth or how I function in the world or how I feel about myself. Honestly, it does not. And I understood that by the time I finished working on it. So once it's done, it's out there doing its work or not doing its work, but I don't have to hang my own sense of self on how the book does.
Because at that point, that's an outcome you can't control, right? So trying to control that would be anxiety and
Well, you can't control it, no.
10 years this book took you to write.
Took me to prepare. It took about 3 years to write, yeah.
You describe it as a calling.
Yeah.
The myth of normal.
Yeah.
What 4 words to sort of pull people in and to in some way summarize a 550 odd page book. Mm-hmm. Why those 4 words? Why that phrase?
Can I pause for a moment to find a quote on my cell phone?
100%.
Yeah. 100%. So this is, are you familiar with the work of Eckhart Tolle?
Oh, Eckhart Tolle, yes.
Okay, yeah. So Tolle lives in Vancouver like I do. And in one of his books he says, the normal state of mind of most human beings contains a strong element of what we might call dysfunction or even madness, So in medical parlance, normal means healthy and natural. So there's a normal range of blood pressure, normal temperature. It's a range. Outside that range, there's no life. There's no health. Either too high or too low, you're gone. So normal means it's equivalent with, synonymous with healthy and natural. However, we make that same assumption that out in society, what we used to, what we call normal, is also healthy and natural, which is a myth. Because I'm saying that in this society, what we consider to be normal is neither healthy nor natural. In fact, it's hurtful to us. So that we're using the word normal in a way that doesn't apply. In a narrow medical sense, it's accurate, but in a broader sense, that which we're used to in this society, we consider normal, is just not good for us, And norm is kind of a statistic, or it's a kind of a average. So if you have a dog, if everybody in London mistreated their dogs, and if you didn't, then you'd be abnormal, So it's a myth to say that what is normal is healthy and natural. That's what I mean by the myth of normal. That's one thing I mean. The other thing I mean is, if we understand the actual science of the unity of everything, I'm not talking about spiritual insight here, I'm talking about, physiological science, that our physiology and psychology is very much affected by our life experiences, beginning in utero, childbirth, early childhood, and throughout the lifetime. It also follows that illness and health are not individual attributes. They're actually manifestations of our relationships and our situation in the world and our history. That also means when the circumstances are abnormal, you expect people to be sick. Just as if you gave animals something that wasn't healthy for them, they'd be sick. That'd be what you'd expect. So this idea that the people who are ill, either physically or mentally abnormal, I say no. These are normal responses to an abnormal set of circumstances. And rather than being sort of those abnormal ones and then the rest of us, it's really a spectrum that we're all, pretty much all on it. So in those three senses, this idea of normal is a myth. And it's one that keeps us from seeing reality.
And we're all abnormal in some way.
Yeah.
So if you maybe my attention is different, maybe my interpersonal relationships are abnormal, but in some way I'm going to be abnormal. As it relates to treatments, how do you think that the medical profession and the psychological profession would respond differently if we removed this idea that there is a normal? How would our approaches change to treating people?
Well, it's a multi-layered answer. First of all, we would recognize that our diagnoses are not explanations for anything. So, I've been diagnosed with ADD, legitimately so. My first book was on it. But it doesn't explain anything. So I tune out easily, very easily, and sometimes often when I don't want to, but, unless I'm highly motivated. So you might say, this person has ADD. How do we know? Because he tunes out a lot. Why does he tune a lot? He's got ADD. How do we know he's got ADD? Because he tunes out a lot. So first of all, we have to understand that our understanding of normal and what's outside the normal, doesn't explain anything. They can describe, if you describe my mental functioning as that of somebody who's got an automatic tendency to tune out, you'd be accurate. So as a description, it's helpful. As an explanation as to why this person isn't behaving quote unquote normally, it doesn't explain a thing. Now, if you understood that I spent my infancy under very difficult circumstances, where I was very stressed because of all the stuff I already talked about, and that tuning out was a normal response to those circumstances as a way of protecting myself from the stress of it all. And this was happening when my brain was developing. Then you'd understand there's nothing abnormal about my tuning out. In fact, it is the normal response to a set of abnormal circumstances. So that's the first point. And I could go through the same kind of dialectic with all manner of physical and mental diseases, by the way, so-called. The second point is...
Why do you say so-called?
Well, look, the disease model is, as long as we understand it's a model, it's okay. When we think it describes reality fully, it doesn't. So, for example, we talk about mental illnesses. And we're assuming that there's a kind of definite pathology there. Just as in rheumatoid arthritis, you can describe the inflammation of the joints and the blood levels of certain antibodies being abnormal and hormonal levels being disturbed. We're making the same assumption in mental illness. There's no such evidence in mental illness. There's no physiological parameters that you can say somebody's got mental illness. There's just been a study a few months ago of thousands of brain scans of people with mental illness diagnoses. There's nothing diagnostic about the brain scans. It's not like I can take an X-ray of a lung and say that this lung has got what we call consolidation or fluid indicating inflammation. There's nothing like that in mental diagnoses. There's no blood test you can do and so on. So illness is a model. I mean, it might, yeah, somebody's really depressed, even suicidal perhaps, and they might need pharmacological intervention, which could really save their lives. That may be true. And in that sense, you may say that they're ill, as long as we realize that this is a construct that we're applying here, but that there's no actual measurement of that that's at all similar to what we call physical disease. But even in physical disease, we make certain assumptions. For example, somebody has rheumatoid arthritis. Now, that nothing wrong with that statement on the face of it, but there's an assumption there. The assumption is that there's this thing called rheumatoid arthritis, and there's this person called me, and this person has this thing. Now, you know, the example I often give, here's my cell phone, I'm holding it in my hand. I have a cell phone. It's not part of me. It says nothing about me. It's a discrete object. Its nature doesn't depend on my nature. Nothing. Is that true about rheumatoid arthritis? Or is it more true to say, as I've found out, that this is a condition that shows up in people with certain life experiences and certain ways of functioning in the world? And that because of the science documented unity of mind and body and the impossibility of separating the activity of our emotional apparatus from, say, our immune system, because it's all one organismic unit. Therefore, when the immune system turns against the body, as it does in rheumatoid arthritis, the immune system actually attacks the body. Is that a thing that's got a life of its own, or is it a process that's happening inside that person because of certain aspects of their lives? Now, if I say it's the thing that happens to you, then that thing has got a life of its own. And that's how most doctors see it. They see somebody with rheumatoid arthritis, they say, okay, this is the kind you've got, this is what's going to happen, this is the only thing we can do is to mitigate the symptoms. I find that's not true. I find that the rheumatoid, by the way, not just I find it, the science finds it, that rheumatoid arthritis is very much related to stress and trauma. And the more stress there is, the more likely it is to flare up. And if people deal with that stress, if they know how to prevent it, their illness abates. Which means that it's not a thing that's separate, it's a process that happens inside them. This is a subtle concept. I'm wondering if I'm explaining it clearly
No,
enough.
you are. And it's really making me question how much we misunderstand the relationship between the mind and the immune system.
Yeah.
Because that's the important connection to understand if you are to accept all the things you've just said,
Yeah.
which we don't understand. I don't think typically we understand that my mind and my immune system have such a close relationship.
Well, there's a whole new science that studies those relationships. It's called psychoneuroimmunology, which studies the interlinked unity of the emotional apparatus of our brain and body with the immune system, with the nervous system, and with the hormonal apparatus. I mean, it's just so obvious. I could change your hormonal state in a split second right now without touching you, just by screaming at you and threatening you. That would necessarily create a change. I mean, it's just clear that our emotions are inseparable. You know, and the other funny thing is, well, several funny things. How do we treat most conditions in medicine, by the way? Inflammations. If you go to a dermatologist with inflamed skin, if you go to a rheumatologist with inflamed joints, if you go to a gastroenterologist with inflamed intestines, if you go to a respirologist with inflamed lungs, if you go to a neurologist with inflamed nervous system, as in multiple sclerosis, they're going to give you steroids to settle the inflammation. Now, what are steroids? They are stress hormones. And you would think that as physicians, we would ask ourselves, gosh, we're treating everything with stress hormones. Does stress maybe have something to do with this condition? Now, when you look at the scientific literature, yes, 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 and yes. So there's a great Canadian physician, actually knighted by Queen Victoria, one of the great medical teachers of all kinds, Sir William Osler. And he said in 1890 that rheumatoid arthritis is a stress-driven disease. The French neurologist Jean Martin Charcot, who first described multiple sclerosis, he said, this is a stress-driven condition. And since then, there's been so much research. So what I'm saying is that this way of looking at what we call disease as a process is so much more accurate scientifically, actually, in understanding the mind-body unity. And then, naturally, when people are traumatized, that has a huge impact on their physiology. Their psychological trauma has a huge impact on their physiology. It's just science, but it's science that's not taught to medical doctors. It's just, for some strange reason, the average physician never hears a single lecture about, say, trauma and its relationship to illness, and yet there's studies internationally, thousands of them, showing those relationships. So there's this strange gap between science and medical practice. But it would change medical practice for the better. Because what would happen if you went to a physician and you presented with your symptom, and they'd say, okay, look, we'll give you such and such medication to deal with your symptoms, and then let's look at your life in the context that you live it, and see how that the stresses that you may be taking on, the traumas you may be carrying, might be affecting the physiology of your body. No, they don't have to be all trauma therapists to do that. They just have to raise the question and to start and to begin the inquiry. That'll make a huge change to that person's life and to their disease process.
And clearly to their kids' lives as well, because I remember reading in your book about the study with the rats. Yeah. And how they... Could you tell me about that study, how the stress study with the rats, and how the parents' treatment of a child impacted their stress response, and then also they passed that on, which I thought was staggering.
Yeah, that was a very interesting study. It was done in Canada at McGill University. I think maybe sometime in the last 20 years, early 2000s, I think. And they looked at how mother rats interacted with their infants, their newborns. And there's this process called grooming, in which the mother rat licks the infant or in the perineal or perianal area, in the genitalia. This is shortly after birth. These mother rats just start licking their infants. Some mother rats did it in a more efficient and caring kind of way than other mother rats. Those that had the better kind of caring, the better kind of grooming, grew to be calmer and responded to stress in more functional ways than those little rats who, as neonates, had not been given that same kind of efficient and quite as caring grooming. And what they found that in the brains of those adult rats who had been groomed one way or the other as infants, the stress apparatus was different, certain receptors for the stress hormones. So one of them could calm themselves more easily than the other. What was interesting is, you might say, well, so what? That's just genetic. The calmer mothers passed on their genes to their infants. No, they didn't. Because if you took the infants of mothers who groomed beautifully and put them with mothers who didn't, and conversely, you took the infant rats of mothers who didn't groom so well, but you put them with mothers who did,
it changed.
It changed the brain for the adult.
It changed the brain?
It changed the genetic functioning, not the genes, but the genetic functioning. This is called epigenetics, how genes are turned on and off by the environment. And then those rats who were groomed well as infants, doesn't matter what the original mother was, but those rats who were groomed well, they went on to groom their infants in exactly the way they'd been groomed. So this is how we pass on our parenting stuff from one generation to the next, both behaviorally, but also through the turning on or off of certain genes.
So in essence, how nurturing our parents were has a big impact on our own ability to handle stress positively or negatively.
Oh, absolutely.
And then we pass that down to our
how
children.
Stressed our parents were, how they reacted to our own stresses as infants, that has everything to do with how our brains handle stress later on. And so some people just don't handle stress very well. They don't handle frustration very well. You should have seen me this morning at the hotel when the swimming pool didn't open in time, But I was a lot better than I might have been years ago, But yeah, our stress responses are very much programmed by our early developmental experiences.
Speaking about our early experiences, the first word in the sort of subtitle of your book is the word trauma.
Yeah.
It's a word that I've talked about a lot on this podcast, and I've had a lot of people here that have opened up about their traumas. How do you define trauma? I know society's defined it in its own way, but how do you define it, the word?
I define it very specifically. It's not something bad that happens to you. It's not that, you know, I went to this movie last night and I was traumatized. No, you weren't. You were just sad, or you had some emotional pain, but you weren't traumatized. Trauma means a wound. That's the literal meaning of the word. It's a Greek word for wounding. So trauma is a psychological wound that you sustain. And it behaves like a wound. So on the one hand, a wound, if it's very raw, if you touch it, it just really hurts. So if I have a wound around not being wanted, then, or the belief that I'm not, then decades later, if anything reminds me of that, it hurts as much as it did when I originally incurred the wound. So in one sense, trauma is an unhealed wound that touched, we get triggered. That's what triggering means, by the way. Some old wound gets activated or touched. And the other thing that happens to wounds is that they scar over. And scar tissue has certain characteristics. It's thick. It has no nerve endings, so there's no feeling in it. So people traumatized disconnect from their feelings. Scar tissue is rigid. It's not flexible. So we lose kind of response flexibility. So when something happens, we tend to react in typical, stereotypical, predictable, dysfunctional ways because of the rigidity. And scar tissue doesn't grow like healthy flesh. So people who are traumatized tend to be stuck in emotional states that characterized their development when they were traumatized. So when somebody says to you, "Don't be such a baby," it doesn't sound very pleasant, but there's some truth to it. It means that you're probably reacting according to the lines of some wound that you sustained as an infant, and now you're reacting as if that wound was happening all over again. This is what one of my friends in the trauma world, Peter Levine, calls the tyranny of the past. So something happens in the present, and we react as if we're back there in the past when this first happened, and we're not in the present moment at all.
And I was trying to figure out how many people, as a percentage of the population, have trauma. But then I read this stat that 60% of adults say that they've had a sort of a traumatic early upbringing or whatever, or traumatic events from their childhood. But then I thought maybe everybody has trauma.
It depends on how we understand trauma. So if we understand trauma as only the really terrible things that happen to people, which do happen to people, you know, in the book I talked about a British friend of mine now living in Canada. They are a yoga teacher and a meditation teacher and a psychologist and an artist, actually. And they grew up in some orphanage here in Britain where they were racially taunted every morning, you know, words that are in the book by her permission, which I'm not going to cite here publicly. And that gave her a sense of deficient, a sense of self, that I'm just not good enough, that I don't belong, and so on. There's those obvious traumas, or the obvious trauma of being sexually abused. So men who are sexually abused, according to a Canadian study, have triple the rate of heart attacks as adults, you know, and all kinds of physiological reasons why that should be the case. So there's those self-evident, big T traumas that we call big T trauma, T with a capital T, trauma with a capital T. There's a certain percentage of the population, much larger than we think, subject to that. If you include all the known factors such as physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, spanking, by the way, has now been shown to be as traumatic as harsher forms of physical abuse. Spanking, which is still recommended by so-called experts, who shall remain unnamed for the moment. The death of a parent, violence in a family, parental violence against each other, a parent being jailed, a parent being mentally ill. Did I say a parent being addicted? A rancorous divorce. These are the identified big traumas, big T traumas. Not to mention poverty, not to mention extreme inequality, war, and so on. But then, if you remember that trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you, it's the wound. People can be wounded not just by bad things happening to them, but small children can be wounded in loving families where they don't get their needs met. I mean, that's obvious in a physical sense. If a child doesn't get proper nutrition, their body will suffer, their mind will suffer. We're also creatures with emotional needs as important as our physical needs. So when the child's emotional needs are not met, that child is wounded. And that's what we call small t trauma, which is not the big ticket events, such as I described, but just the child's need to be loved unconditionally, to be held when distressed, to be responded to be seen, to be heard, to be allowed their full range of emotion without them being stamped on in the name of so-called discipline. The right to play creatively, spontaneously, out there in nature, not with these damn digital gadgets that subvert and hijack the child's imagination, but spontaneous play that's essential for brain development. So what I'm saying is that when these needs are not for the unconditional loving attachment relationship, when those needs are frustrated, children are also hurt. And I call that trauma as well, because it shows up later in life as the impact of painful wounds. So trauma in this society, for all kinds of reasons, is far more common than we imagine.
From sitting here and speaking to, I don't know, somewhere over 100 different people that come from all walks of life, but specifically people that are successful in their industries. And you talked about, you know, how an anomalous early upbringing can create sort of abnormality in an adult. A lot of the people I sit here are successful because of some kind of abnormality, or at least their interpretation of some kind of early event that caused them to have some sort of abnormal belief about themselves, that they're not enough, so they become a billionaire or a gold medalist or whatever it might be. One of the things that I thought I could predict is, I thought after doing 100 episodes, if they told me the traumatic event they'd been through, I could predict the outcome in them. But there's a disconnect there, because, you know, I'd sit here with a guest who went through one of your capital T traumas, like domestic violence. And one of them might become incredibly angry. And one of them might become the most peaceful, loving person I've ever met. And that taught me that there's this thing in between the event, which is what you call interpretation. And I found that as that kind of makes it really difficult to diagnose.
Well, no, look, so the two examples you gave, that really peaceful person may be really peaceful for genuinely good reasons, such as they've found the milk of human love flowing through their veins and they've had some spiritual reconciliation with the world, or they may have genuinely learned compassion for themselves and others. But they could also be very nice and peaceful because they're suppressing their healthy anger, because they're actually sitting on their rage unconsciously, which is going to show up in the form of some kind of health manifestation, I guarantee you, later on. So you can't tell from the outside without asking some questions. Or I can give you the example of a Donald Trump who had a really traumatic childhood. I mean, his father was as described by his psychologist niece, Mary Trump, Trump's father, who is Mary's grandfather, was a psychopath, and who really demeaned and harshly treated their children. So Trump decides unconsciously that, by the way, I'm not talking about his policies here. This is not a political debate. And in the book, I point out that his opponent was also traumatized, Hillary Clinton. So this is a ecumenical view of trauma in politics. I'm not choosing sides. I'm just saying that you can see his trauma in every moment he opens his mouth. His grandiosity, his need to make himself bigger, more powerful, aggressive. And he's as much as said in his autobiography that the world is a horrible place, a dog-eat-dog place, where everybody is after you. Everybody wants your wife and your house and your wealth, and this is your friends, never mind your enemies. But that's the world he lives in. Now, that world that he lives in reflects his childhood home. He developed that worldview. He came to it honestly, you might say, because that's the world that he lived in. And he gets to be really successful in this crazy world, you know, financially, although people question, you know, was he really as big a success as he says he was? But he certainly was successful politically, if by success you mean the attainment of power. His brother, on the other hand, Mary Trump's father, Trump's niece's father, drank himself to death. And they were both responses to the same. You can never say it's exactly the same for two kids, but there was a toxic home environment. One ends up dead as an alcoholic. The other ends up at the pinnacle of power. And when I look at them both, I see dysfunction there, significant dysfunction there.
So one of the consequences of that early upbringing was it materialized itself as sort of addiction, and the other got the same psychological reinforcement, or the thing missing from power and work and money.
Well, Donald Trump learned that the way to survive is to be aggressive and harsh and competitive and to get the other before they get to you, which is a faithful reproduction of his early childhood experiences. So for him, these were not choices so much as survival techniques. And when they talk about his lying, well, I don't know when he's lying and when he's not, but my sense is that often he actually believes what he's saying. And actually his biographer, or the person who co-wrote his quasi-autobiography called The Art of the Deal, this writer says that he's never met anybody who's so capable of believing something that's not true to be true if he wants it to be true. Now that's the mark of a traumatized child, a denial of reality. It is an inauguration. There was a certain number of people that came to he couldn't stand it that there weren't as many people there as came to Barack Obama's inauguration. There were a much smaller number of people there. He created this reality where many more people came to his inauguration. Now, what age behavior is that? That's a 4-year-old where more kids came to his party than my party. That can't be true. But that's Donald's way of dealing with reality. It's not a moral failing as such. That's how he survived. And these survival mechanisms then get to form our personalities. And again, in this world, sometimes they pay off in certain ways.
Is that often the case with pathological liars? They've learnt to lie as a way to survive.
Oh, absolutely. The German philosopher, writer Friedrich Nietzsche said, people lie their way out of reality who have been hurt by reality. And so I've lied, like when I had my shopping addiction, I lied every day to my wife, and even afterwards, when she stopped trying to change my behavior, I said, just tell me, if you're going to shop, you're going to spend another $1,000 on music. Just tell me. I still couldn't, because I was so ashamed of it. And so the lying became like a way of survival for me.
Defense against reality.
It's a defense against reality, and it's a defense against being judged. Well, that says something about my childhood. Nobody's born a liar. As we say in this book, there are congenital liars, but there are no congenital liars. No one-day-old baby tells any lies. No one-day-old baby pretends anything. If we end up pretending in any way at all, to the extent that we do, it's because we had to learn that's what we must do to survive.
You said something at the start when I gave the example that I sat with a guest here who went through domestic abuse, and they are the calmest person. And then you said, well, maybe they're suppressing it. And in fact, the minute you said that, it reminded me of something they said, which is they said to me on this podcast that they had angry outbursts all the time. So sometimes their child will come up to them and want to play when they're working, and they'll snap. And they're trying to deal with that.
Yeah, that's what I meant, that they're sitting on this volcanic crater of anger, which sometimes bursts out of them. So their demeanor is like a really developed, suppressed way of handling rage, which rage, when they were children, had they expressed, would have got them into more trouble. So suppressing it, repressing it, became their survival. It's all about survival, you see. So it became their survival mechanism. Now, that person, as long as they keep it that way, they're at risk. They're at risk for mental health diagnoses like depression. Because what is depression? It means you're pushing something down. That's what it means. What do we push down? Our natural emotions. Why do we push them down? Because we have to survive. So that person, I don't know I can't prognosticate what's going to happen to them. But if they don't work it out, in general, they're at risk for some kind of mental or physical manifestation. That's my experience.
Quick one. Some of you may know we've got a brand new sponsor on this podcast, American Express. And you've got a brand new exclusive offer for a limited time only, which I can't wait to tell you about. From the 18th of October to the 16th of November, American Express is offering new card members a 60,000 point membership reward as a welcome bonus when you join, when you spend a minimum of £8,000 across the first 3 months. This is simply a thank you for joining American Express. And for those that don't know, you can use your American Express Business Platinum Card points in exchange for various rewards such as booking travel, holidays, gift cards, and so much more. So essentially, you're rewarded with huge prizes for just using their card to spend on your usual purchases. And I've had a look through at what 60,000 points can get you. So if you'd like to find out how you can get your hands on your new American Express Business Card, then search American Express Business Platinum Card to find out more. Quick one from our longest standing sponsor, Huel. I can't tell you over the last, really it's been about 2.5 years. It was really post-pandemic, how much my health has become such a huge priority in my life. Huel has been probably the most important partner in my health journey because I've been in the boardrooms, I've been to their offices tens and tens and tens and tens of times. I've seen how they make their decisions on nutrition. And that's why it's such a wonderful thing to be able to talk to this audience about a brand and a product that is so unbelievably linked to my values and the place I am in my life of valuing the gym, exercise, movement, my mind, my breathing, and all of those things. And most importantly, my nutrition. That is the role Huel plays. And so every time I get to read these ads out, I do it with such passion because I really, really believe every word I'm saying. And I absolutely love the brand. So if you haven't already tried Huel and you've been resistant to my pestering, then give it a go and let me know how you get on. You talked about expressing one's emotions, and something you've talked about in this book, but also previously, is this idea that there is such a thing as healthy anger. Yeah. It's one of the 7 A's of healing, as you say. The first being a topic we've talked about already, which is acceptance. Yeah. The next being awareness.
Well, awareness I wish we had put into this book, but we didn't. Not into this book. In this book, I put 4 A's, and I left out awareness, and that was an omission on my part.
Really?
Yeah, it was. I'm sorry, but it was.
So in the book, you have authenticity, anger,
acceptance,
autonomy, agency,
authenticity, and agency. Yeah.
And acceptance. Yeah. So awareness. You've said before this book that awareness is the starting point.
Yeah.
I found that to be so true in my life, but it's not very easy. I feel like awareness is a luxury or a privilege that is very hard fought. Yeah. Because you're guessing. Yeah. You're guessing based on pattern recognition. So I was guessing 25 years old, I can't get into a relationship. Anytime a girl comes near me, even if I've pursued her, I run off. And to figure out why I was doing that, to even identify the behavior pattern and go, that's not helpful. That's not going to lead me to feeling whole. Yeah. Where does that come from? Took 25 years and a lot of introspection. But most people, they're living unaware of the puppet master of trauma that is driving their life. That's
a really good analogy. The trauma really is like a puppet master behind the scenes in the unconscious, pulling your strings, and you're not aware of it. You know, do you remember Pinocchio?
Yeah.
So you remember what Pinocchio says at the end when he finally becomes a real boy?
Yeah.
He says, how foolish I was when I was a puppet. And to the extent that we're being activated by these unconscious strings that our trauma is pulling behind the scenes, and we're acting in our lives and we think we're autonomous, free beings, but we're actually being controlled by something in the past that we haven't worked out, we're puppets. We're actually puppets. And there's not much freedom in that. There's no freedom in it at all. So, I mean, I suppose the opposite of trauma, if you want to revisit that question, is liberation.
Interesting. Liberation and by reconnection.
By reconnection, but liberation from the inexorable power of the unconscious.
Which is like cutting the strings in a way. Kind of brings me to, there's kind of 2 ways I want to go with that. But the first question I have about trauma and the puppet master analogy is, do we ever really cut the strings? Or do we just kind of learn to pull against them when they try and tell us to do something with more force than they're exerting in the opposite direction?
That doesn't work very well. pushing against it because that's still reactive. You're still not in charge. You're just in automatic resistance mode to something. There's no freedom in that either, you know?
So still up.
So, yeah. But awareness that you mentioned is huge because once you're aware that there's this... See, the thing about these strings may not fray right away, but once you're aware that, this reaction of mine, it's not about what's going on right now. There's something old being activated here. That awareness alone weakens it slackens the strings a bit. No, they're no longer as taut. They're no longer as automatically capable of pulling on you. So it does have to begin with awareness of them. Ultimately, if we realize that this puppet master is just a desperate little